Without further ado, let's hand it over to Nikita.
Thanks, Bruce. Hi, everyone. Thank you guys for coming out and for staying out for one of the end talks of the day. It's been a very filled day. My name is Nikita. I work on data privacy and specifically privacy assurance for users who contribute to various data archives. My co-conspirator Kenny couldn't make it today, last minute work emergency type of thing, so he sends his apologies, but that means you guys are stuck with me for the whole thing. So why talk about image security? Well, over the last few years, the number of images that have been bantered about has skyrocketed. One of the stats up here you see is that the number of Instagram users jumped to 500 million over the last few years. Similarly, we have a preponderance of attacks against that ever-expanding image data set. There's an ever more increasing capabilities of data mining technologies to be able to exploit those images. So on the one hand, we have more and more images. On the other hand, we have more and more attacks and data mining approaches to those images, which all culminates in we need to start taking the photos that we take in other images very seriously. And so what we'll be doing today is exploring the various ways that images can be attacked, that information, actionable intelligence can be extracted from images in both obvious and maybe not so obvious ways. And then we'll be talking about kind of mitigating those threat vectors by talking about counter-forensic ways or modes of counter-surveillance that we can do to protect the images and those within them. And specifically, we'll be talking throughout this presentation about three things, about alteration, obfuscation, and redaction. So before we kind of start off, take a few minutes to look at this photo, and you could get it online at tinyurl.com/justadesk, and think about what is wrong with this image. We'll come back to this at the very end of the talk, but for now you guys can access it and poke around with it and see what is wrong. And there are many things wrong, at least 13, I think, or 16 things I counted, but we'll come back to this. That URL again is tinyurl.com/justadesk. So before we begin, this is kind of the typology of what we're going to talk about today, various image privacy concerns. The first big one is metadata. Of course, this is what we'll spend most of the time talking about it, but it's only one of 6 potential attack vectors. So next we'll be talking about secondary information leaks. Aside from metadata, what other data leaks in an image? Then we'll be talking about particular redaction protocols, or what you can do to scrub images or obfuscate data. And then for the second half of the talk, we'll be talking about various image discovery techniques. So these are attacks that adversaries use to find images that you may not want found. So let's start off with metadata. I probably don't have to tell anyone in this room what metadata is, but it is very simply data about data. Within the context of an image, this specifically means data about the image that is embedded in the image file, but that is not usually readily viewable in a standard vanilla image viewer. And there are different kinds of metadata formats and standards. The most common one, the one that we'll be talking about today, is Exif, the exchangeable image file format, but there's others like IPTC for keyword tagging. It's often used in journalism and so on, but we'll be focusing on Exif today. So how do we view metadata? There's 2 very basic techniques, the kind of Swiss Army knife of image and document metadata retrieval and alteration is known as ExifTool. This is a very comprehensive command line tool that we'll go through in a second. If you want a more friendly GUI version, there's browser add-ons like Exif Viewer, which are also very convenient, easy to use. But the one thing I want to stress here is the one way to not view metadata is by using web-based services. Okay? There's so many websites nowadays where you can upload an image and it will read the metadata for you, or it will claim to scrub the metadata for you. And the reason you should not use this is, of course, there's no guarantee that whoever runs that server or whoever is intercepting that server will not log the data that you upload. So there's 3 broad ways of viewing metadata, right? You could do it locally in the browser, locally in a standalone application, or remotely on a web-based application. The third way is something to avoid at all costs. So let's look at another sample image right now. This isn't the one we started with. We'll come back to that one at the end. But this is just an intermediate case that we can look at. So you can get online at tinyurl, cite a room, and let's see what happens if we open this image in Exif Viewer. We could select a local location or a remote URL, plug it in, and Exif Viewer will give you a very neat readout. We could also do the same thing with ExifTool by opening in the command line and get a nice readout in plain text. So what kinds of information can metadata reveal? Well, the first thing, if you look at the readout, is there's a barrage of technical minutiae, right? There's things like aperture, shutter speed, things like that. While that is important, that is not what we'll be looking at today. We'll be looking at what we call immediately actionable intelligence. These are things like the how. How was the image taken? What camera was used? What model? What brand? What specific unique camera? We'll be talking about the when. So what time, what date, what time zone was the image taken in? Or at what time? Then we'll be talking about GPS coordinates, which of course tell us where the image was taken. Then we could talk about who took the image in the sense of the name of the camera owner, which may be prevalent in the image somewhere. And finally, we'll be talking about the what. And this can occur in things like the thumbnail of the original image can be hidden in the metadata. And so I said before that we're not focusing on the kind of the technical metadata minutia, but that's not to say that we should dismiss it. The reason I'm not talking about it today is because there has been already an extensive body of work done on that technical minutia. And the point to take away is that a camera can be uniquely identified based on the various imperfections in things like how it takes the images and little grains or cracks in the lens. You know that old adage, right? A camera is like a gun. This is true not just from an aphorism perspective, but it is true forensically as well. A camera really is like a gun. So let's talk about the first set is the how the image was taken, so specifically the camera data. So we start off by a very broad analysis, which can tell us the general brand of camera that was used to take an image. We could narrow that down by finding out the specific model that camera was taken in. And finally, we could narrow it down even further, pinpointing it to a unique camera based on the unique camera serial number that may or may not be in the data. And serial numbers really do require special considerations because they're so very important, because they can link, they're that final link that allows one to link a camera to a potential owner and therefore potential taker of the photo. And there's various ways that various adversaries can extract serial number information and link that then to an identifiable target. The first is, did you ever fill out a product registration form when you received a camera? If yes, and you submitted it online, then there's probably, the manufacturer probably has a record of that particular camera. The other attack vector is insurance inventories or asset lists. When you filled out your insurance forms, did you list your camera and then the serial number as you deal with all other electronics? If so, then potential state actors could exfiltrate that piece of information from the insurance agency. And finally, are there any other photos online that have that same serial number? There's any number of search engines available nowadays, or you could just do a regular web search for that specific serial number, and you could find other images that were taken with the same camera, right? Which should then lead to de-anonymization of the source as well as the taker. So looking now at the date and time, there are various timestamps embedded in the metadata that are different from just the file timestamps, right? So if you just modify, use whatever Metasploit kit includes date modification in it, that will not modify the actual metadata. And so you need to pay attention to the timestamps. And this is things like the date the photo was taken, the date it was modified, the date the GPS coordinates were recorded often have their own timestamps. Okay, so if you run across timestamps in a camera's metadata, don't stop in the first field, look through everything. And finally, the date and time data can then be, of course, correlated to specific events and specific locations. So if you know that an image was taken at such and such time, at such and such place, right, we could then correlate that to, for instance, CCTV footage and zoom in on who specifically was taking the photo. And then the time zone can also be used to corroborate GPS data, for instance. Conversely, and this will become important in a second, is if you modify GPS data or timestamp data and they don't sync up, that will be a huge red flag that the data has been tampered with. So a constant theme that you'll see throughout this talk is that you need to be consistent in either your deletion or your modification of data to make sure that all the points match up. So GPS data, the point of this slide is just to show you that it has become increasingly accurate over time. Right? GPS is now a serious threat that needs to be taken into account. Even if you say, well, it's not totally accurate, I don't care if it knows where I am, it is becoming increasingly accurate. And finally, we have the camera owner name. So when you get your camera nowadays, vendors love to push personalization, right? So they say, you should put in your name, especially if you get a high-end camera. When you first boot it up, it oftentimes asks you to register a name. Don't. This is something that lots of people do and then forget about it. And then they don't realize that their name has now been passed on into the metadata. And the same principle applies to SD cards or other folders that you have in your camera. Don't leave identifying names that could potentially be leaked. And then the last piece of metadata is thumbnail data. So prior to this, all the examples of metadata that I mentioned have been purely text-based, right? But metadata can be binary data too. It can contain images themselves. So let's say you take a photo, you open it up in Photoshop, you crop out the potentially compromising elements, you save it, and you think you're good. You're not good. Chances are that that photo has the original uncropped image preserved as a thumbnail within that metadata. And now, aside from that, also if you're on Windows, you have a whole other sector to worry about in that Windows also embeds its own thumbnail metadata, not in the image file, but in the directory that the particular image is in. So we've talked about kind of some of the more actionable metadata elements. Now let's talk about deleting them. The good news is that it is very easy to do. It's a single command in ExifTool, simply the parameter -all blank, which means that all data gets wiped. Okay? And you could use the same thing, again, if you're in Windows to remove entire folders and so on. There's various ways of automating this. Well, actually, I just lied. It's not that easy. There's some metadata that we can call persistent. This is data that does not like to be deleted for whatever reason. A particularly notorious example of this is in PNG images, we have various text chunks. There's 3 main text chunks, the I text, the TX, and the Z text. For whatever reason, ExifTool cannot wipe this data by using its default settings. It will also, however, not tell you that it has not wiped this data. The takeaway from this is that you should never rely on automation, right? There's these great tools that can wipe and modify data for you, but you should not rely on them to do their job concretely. And if you open the image in the hex editor after you think that you've wiped it, you could still go into it and find remnant chunks of persistent metadata. So the takeaway, the crucial takeaway from this is do not trust automation. Do not trust tools that claim to do something. You need to go in and do a manual deep dive. And the best practice when you're doing that deep dive is that deletion by default. Okay? In other words, you should approach this from the mindset of, unless I have a damn good reason to keep this metadata in the image, I need to delete it. You should not approach this from the mindset of, unless I have something that I specifically care about, only then should I delete it. You should delete by default. Okay? You should not keep data by default. And the reason for this is that data that you think is innocuous, that you think doesn't matter, could come back and sting you. A very trivial example of this is, let's say you're walking down the street and you pop 3 photos, A, B, C. Right? Photo A and photo C, you want people to see where you've been, pretty landmarks or whatever, so you don't really care about them. Photo B, on the other hand, let's say you stop by a location that could be more controversial for whatever reason, and so you wipe the metadata from this photo and then you upload all of them to whatever album. The locations and timestamps in A and C could, of course, then used to potentially identify where you were in point B. So the point is, even innocuous images, when combined with sensitive images, can be used to de-anonymize things that you want anonymized. So again, the key takeaway from this is implement deletion by default. Okay? And this applies to vendors as well, where if you're developing any photo handling suites, you want deletion enabled by default with the relevant warnings and stuff, but to protect users. So we talked about deleting metadata. Now let's talk about modifying or spoofing it. So the good thing is there's a very comprehensive list on the ExifTool page of various metadata tags. And let's go ahead and look at our second image, which you have downloaded, and see how we could spoof the GPS coordinates. Again, this is very easy to do. The first thing is we could find a map-based service that has GPS coordinates. We can use Google Maps. We can use OpenStreetMap, whatever we want. So here, if we were to use Google Maps, we would simply pick the location, click on what's here, find the coordinates, get them, convert them from decimal to degree notation, and then plug them into ExifTool, and we can successfully change the location of the photograph. However, when we modify images, the metadata of images, as opposed to just deleting them, we need to exercise very, very careful caution. One of the reasons for this is maker notes. So maker notes are manufacturer-specific metadata tags that will exist in one model but not in another. So if you modify the Exif data for Sony and try to make it look like a Nikon camera took it, but you don't specifically modify each and every maker note, you will, again, raise a red flag. And adversaries are familiar with this, right? Here's a quote from law enforcement trade publication that explicitly highlights the fact that if the maker notes don't match up, then that's a red flag that data has been tampered with. Okay, so we need to assume adversarial familiarity, right? In other words, those who are our adversaries in this case, they will know to check for consistency. Because if they can show inconsistency, then they can show tampering, and then they could foil the counterforensic process, right? The point of counterforensics is, if the point of forensics is that everything leaves a trace, the point of counterforensics is to make sure that it does not leave a trace. For this, we need to be extremely consistent. So that's a lot of talk about metadata, but like I mentioned, that is only one of the possible attack vectors. Another one is secondary location leakage. In other words, even if we remove the GPS data and the time zone and so on from photos, there's still a large amount of localisms or visual clues in the image that can betray the location. And these are things like brand names, something that's only produced in one country or one region of a country, native plants and animals, things like any textual data, like the language of signs or newspapers, the date on a newspaper, things like light switches, electrical sockets, identifiable locations like landmarks, and keep in mind that all of these can be selectively cropped from an image and searched for. So just to give you an example, an electrical outlet in a photo can reveal almost sometimes the exact country or at least the region that the photo was taken in, which of course means that if, and remember what I said about consistency, right? So let's take an example of we modify a camera's GPS data to say that it's in Belize, but then we leave a North American outlet, right? That again allows forensic investigators to point to an inconsistency in the image and foil the seamless aim of counterforensics. So when I talk about consistency, it stretches from the technical minutia of modifying actual metadata to the actual on-hands physical details of going in and replacing a wall socket. Even things like the height of the socket can also betray potential locations. So you either want to obfuscate that in a photo or alter it, and I don't mean in Photoshop because these things can be reversed with relative ease, but I mean actually physically prior to taking the photo. There are also, aside from localisms, additional visual clues, which I term slippage, or things which unwittingly betray your potential identity. Things like reflections. If you're reflected in a window or something like that, exposing stray body parts in the corner, potentially revealing your height by standing next to something, allowing location calculations. For instance, if you take an image at a certain angle, it can be calculated where exactly in the room you were. And again, there's lots of existing research on this kind of stuff. And all this boils down to is that any extraneity in a photo is a liability. That means that any potential image within an image, right, any stray thing in a photo, the height at which a photo was taken, everything is a liability and everything needs to be scrutinized for high sensitivity images. So now let's talk a little bit about how we would redact this data. So the first thing is that we need to do redaction, not blurring or any kind of gimmicky filters. And the reason is because there has been research done on deducing with good probability potentially blurred data based on things like known font sets or known reflections and so on. And similarly, we need to avoid this urge, there's lots of gimmicky toy filters like swirl and so on. These can be potentially undone. And so when I talk about redaction, I do mean the actual old school rectangle redaction, not blurring. And remember, you said everything matters in a photo, every extraneity. So we take this case where it's a photo of you and your dog. You remove yourself, but you want to share, a photo of your dog on Reddit or something. Well, that image itself can now be taken and potentially leveraged. If it could be identified, for instance, what approximate location the photo was taken, right, then we could start checking various pet-related records, right? We could start looking into pet store purchasing records. We could start looking at local veterinary records, at other service records like grooming services or, daycare services. It could even be something as simple as going to the local dog park and then seeing who walks with that particular dog, or performing neighborhood surveillance if you're sure that a photo was taken in a particular neighborhood. So this means that everyone matters in a photo, right? Not just people. Finally, just like we had our principle of always delete instead of always leave and delete only if necessary, always redact more than you think you need to. So in other words, overdeletion is always preferable to underdeletion. And the reason for this is we need to avoid leaving any kind of tangential or peripheral leaks, specifically sender or descender remnants in letters. Like we see in the middle example, we have the descenders all and the ascenders all visible, which can allow us, once we figure out the font that is, to deduce what word that likely is with a good amount of probability. And finally, you need to redact more than the actual word to, again, foil probable word size attacks. So we've talked about dealing with image redaction and so on, but now let's talk about how attackers can discover images. So the first technique is known as fusking, which is quite simply the enumeration of photographs. So let's say you have a photo on your site. You have the directory listing prevented or turned off, so someone can't just go up folder and look in images, but could someone simply enumerate all potential image numbers? And cameras have very common file naming notations that we can exploit. And here a note that even the file name can betray the model of the camera. For instance, if there's an N after DSC, that usually means that it was taken with a Nikon. And the thing to remember about fusking is that this is not just a numerical attack. We can also run a very basic dictionary attack for common terms like vacation, kids, and so on. And again, this can lead to enumeration of images that we don't want found. The point is then here to use non-obvious file names. The second form of image discovery is CBIR, or content-based image retrieval. And what this practically means is that it searches for image content as opposed to image name, although it can reveal image name, as will be seen shortly. So to take an example, let's say I have this image called Mystery Cat. We go to Google's reverse image search, add in the image, and not only does Google then tell us other places that this image is hosted, but notably, as you see on the bottom left, it also tells us what this image is likely called. Okay? And so here we just have the harmless name of a meme, but let's say you're trying to identify a landmark. You crop a landmark out of a photo, run it through Google Images, and you not only see other places that host this image, but also what this particular landmark is called. And like you said, the key considerations for CBIR is, as he just explained, image components of it can be isolated and searched for by themselves, which can lead to identifying the location. But also, people sometimes don't realize this, but even when you post a video, we could take a still frame from that video and run that through CBIR search engines too, and find out the location that the video was taken in as well. So that's something to keep in mind, is that this does not just apply to still images, because what is a movie but just a collection of thousands of still images. And finally, the third form of image discovery is social media mining, which is simply leveraging social media to find other similar images. So let's say a friend took a photo of you and put it on their account. That eventually leads you to finding the friend's account, and potentially from there, through doing very basic acquaintance mapping, finding out you and who your friends are. This can also lead to leveraging image captioning. So let's say you see an image of a party, and the caption for that is "celebrating my birthday." Boom, you just have someone's date of birth. Okay? So this is something that we need to be extremely careful about, is how images are propagated. And finally, a note on vendor responsibility is that secure image handling should not be simply on the end user's shoulders. Whenever possible, these solutions should be integrated into the software design workflow from the ground up. But of course, as I said before, on the flip side is end users should not trust vendor products to do this for them. So we need to come at it from both sides. In other words, vendors need to step up their game and add image privacy settings whenever possible as defaults, but users, on the other hand, need to also perform due diligence. And finally, a note on cloud-based services is a good way for vendors to minimize liability and at the same time boost user privacy is to minimize data retention times. So now we can come back to this photo, and you all can look at what you noted down in the beginning and what you see nowadays after the talk, if there's anything different that you see, and hopefully you took something away from this. So the key three takeaways that I want to end on is information leakage is non-obvious, right? Things that you think don't matter may matter very, very much, right? The kind of chair you're sitting on may betray where exactly you're sitting on it. And this will lead us to, again, always keep the three principles that have been in the background in mind to alter, obfuscate, and redact. And finally, be wary of not just the technical leaks, the metadata, but of environmental leaks, which are just as important. And finally, keep in mind the broader ecosystem that your image may propagate in when you put it online. And finally, to quote Robert De Niro from Ronin, is whenever there's any doubt, there is no doubt. So if you ever are dealing with particularly sensitive images that you don't know if you have removed anything, opt on the side of not sharing that. Thank you.